Hello, bored people, and welcome back to Muted History. Take a breath wherever you are. Maybe you're lying in bed scrolling through videos at 2 a.m. Maybe you're cooking dinner with your phone propped against the salt shaker. Or perhaps you're just looking for something that won't assault your eardrums with unnecessary drama. This is your space to slow down, with stories that actually happened, told without the hype, without the clickbait, just patient storytelling backed by science and honest about what we don't know. If you appreciate this kind of long-form content, the kind that respects your intelligence and doesn't treat history like a series of explosions, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It's a small gesture that helps this type of content reach other people who, like you, are searching for something deeper than the usual noise. And I'd love to know how you use these videos. Are you falling asleep to them, listening while you work, cooking, commuting through a city I'll never see? Let me know in the comments, because knowing there are others out there who appreciate this slower approach to learning makes all the difference. Oh, and if you drift off during any part of this series, don't worry. I'll put timestamps in the description so you can pick up exactly where you left off tomorrow. Because this story, the entire history of sailing and humanity's first great ocean crossing, deserves to be heard from beginning to end. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Now tonight we're beginning a journey that spans hundreds of thousands of years, from the first human who ever wondered what lay beyond the horizon to the moment our species became truly global. This is the story of how we learned to float, to navigate, to trust ourselves to the vast indifference of open water. And it begins long before anyone ever built a boat. What does it mean to be afraid of water? Not the rational fear of drowning, not the healthy respect for currents and depths, but the deeper, more primitive terror that water represents the end of everything knowable. For most of human existence, that's exactly what it meant. Rivers could be forded if you were brave and the water was low. Lakes could be walked around if you had enough time and patience. But the ocean, that endless expanse where the sky seemed to press down against the waves, was different. It wasn't just dangerous, it was absolute. A wall built from liquid that said quite clearly, this is where your world ends. Standing on any beach today, it's almost impossible to imagine water as a barrier rather than a pathway. We've built our entire modern world on the assumption that oceans connect rather than divide. Cargo ships carry goods between continents as routinely as trucks carry them between cities. Passenger jets fly routes that were once unthinkable ocean crossings. Even our digital lives depend on cables that run along the ocean floor, connecting us to people on the far side of what were once impossible distances. But for the vast majority of human history, water meant something entirely different. It meant the edge of the possible world. And the transformation from barrier to highway, from ending to beginning, is one of the most quietly revolutionary changes in human consciousness. It didn't happen suddenly. It didn't happen because of a single brilliant inventor or a moment of inspiration. It happened because of curiosity, necessity, and the accumulated courage of countless individuals who looked at the horizon and wondered what might lie beyond it. The story begins much earlier than you might expect, long before anyone ever thought to hollow out a log or lash bamboo poles together, long before the first sail caught wind or the first paddle disturbed still water. There were humans living along coastlines who had begun to develop a different relationship with the sea. These weren't sailors in any sense we would recognize. They were foragers, hunter-gatherers, who had learned to exploit the resources that existed where land met water. They understood tides not because they wanted to navigate by them, but because they needed to know when shellfish would be accessible. They watched the movements of fish not because they planned to follow them into deep water, but because they needed to predict when and where food would be available in the shallows. This coastal lifestyle developed independently in many parts of the world, wherever humans encountered rich marine environments. Along the shores of what is now South Africa, early human communities learned to harvest shellfish, collect seaweed, and hunt seals in the surf zone. In the Mediterranean, people developed techniques for gathering mussels and sea urchins from tidal pools. Along the coasts of Southeast Asia, communities learned to exploit the incredible diversity of tropical marine ecosystems. But living near water and living with water are two very different things. The leap from coastal foraging to actually venturing onto the water required a fundamental shift in human psychology. It required overcoming not just practical challenges, but existential ones. The ocean demanded a new kind of courage, the courage to leave solid ground behind and trust your life to materials and techniques that had never been tested by evolution. Humans are terrestrial animals. We didn't evolve to float. Our bodies are dense enough to sink, our instincts calibrated for solid ground beneath our feet. Everything about venturing onto water goes against our biological programming. And yet, sometime around 70,000 years ago, in the warm waters of Southeast Asia, something began to change. Archaeological evidence from this period is frustratingly sparse, partly because the coastlines where these developments took place are now underwater, drowned by rising seas that followed the end of the last ice age. But genetic studies of modern populations tell a story that stone tools and ancient hearths cannot. They tell us that humans had learned to cross significant bodies of water by this time, because the only way to explain the distribution of human populations is through successful ocean crossings. The first hints of this transformation probably came through accident rather than intention. A fallen tree that didn't sink when it hit the water, a tangle of bamboo that supported weight instead of collapsing, a natural raft formed by storm debris that carried someone farther from shore than they had ever been before. These accidental encounters with buoyancy would have been revelations. Here was proof that solid objects could be supported by water, that the liquid barrier might not be as absolute as it appeared. But recognizing that certain materials float is very different from understanding how to use that knowledge for transportation. That required experimentation, observation, and the kind of systematic thinking that we often underestimate in our ancient ancestors. The people who made this leap weren't primitive. They were innovators working without precedent, trying to solve problems that no human had ever solved before. The materials they had to work with varied depending on their environment, but the principle was universal. They needed to find or create objects that could support human weight while remaining stable and controllable in water. In tropical regions, bamboo was often the material of choice. It's naturally hollow, making it incredibly buoyant relative to its weight. It's also strong, flexible, and grows in convenient lengths. A few bamboo poles lashed together with plant fibre could create a platform capable of supporting several people. In other regions, people learned to work with different materials. Inflated animal skins could provide buoyancy. Bundles of reeds or rushes, if properly prepared and bound, could create surprisingly seaworthy vessels. Even simple log rafts, despite their weight, could be made functional with the right selection of wood and proper construction techniques. But the materials were only part of the challenge. The real breakthrough was conceptual. Someone, somewhere, had to make the mental leap from seeing water as an obstacle to seeing it as a medium that could be navigated. This required developing new ways of thinking about space, movement, and control. On land, you move by pushing against solid ground. On water, you move by pushing against a fluid that gives way beneath your efforts. The physics are different, the sensory experience is different, even the way you maintain balance and stability is different. Learning to work with water rather than against it was probably a gradual process that took place over many generations. Early attempts were likely clumsy and dangerous. Rafts that worked perfectly in calm conditions might fall apart in choppy water. Lashing techniques that seemed secure on dry land might loosen fatally when everything got wet and began to swell and shift. The learning curve was steep, and the consequences of failure were severe, but gradually, through trial and error, observation and refinement, some coastal communities began to develop genuine expertise in watercraft construction and handling. They learned which knots held best when wet. They discovered how to position their weight to maintain stability. They figured out how to use simple paddles to control direction and speed. Most importantly, they learned to read water conditions, to recognize when it was safe to venture out and when it was better to stay on shore. These early water users were still very much coastal people. They ventured out only in good weather, stayed within sight of land, and returned to shore each night. But they had crossed a crucial threshold. They had proven that humans could survive on water, that the barrier between land and sea was permeable. And once that barrier was breached, even in small ways, it could never be rebuilt. The psychological impact of these early successes was probably as important as the practical achievements. Communities that had mastered basic watercraft began to see their world differently. Distances that had once seemed absolute became merely challenging. Islands that had been unreachable became potential destinations. The horizon, instead of marking the end of the world, began to suggest possibilities that lay beyond it. This shift in perspective was crucial for what came next, because the real revolution in human seafaring wasn't just about learning to float, or even learning to navigate short distances in calm water. It was about developing the confidence and skill necessary to venture beyond the sight of land, to cross open ocean toward destinations that might exist only in hope and imagination. The communities that would eventually make this leap were concentrated in Southeast Asia, in the complex archipelago of islands that stretches from modern-day Indonesia to the Philippines. This was an ideal environment for developing maritime skills. The islands were separated by water gaps of varying widths, creating natural stepping stones for increasingly ambitious voyages. The climate was generally favourable, with predictable seasonal patterns that experienced navigators could learn to read and use. And the waters were rich in marine life, providing both motivation and reward for those brave enough to venture out. But even in this seemingly ideal environment, the transition from coastal paddling to true ocean navigation was neither inevitable nor easy. It required not just technological innovation, but social innovation as well. Ocean crossings couldn't be attempted by individuals working alone. They required community support, collective planning, and social institutions that could organise and sustain risky ventures whose outcomes were far from certain. The boats that would eventually make these crossings possible were probably quite simple by modern standards, but they represented the culmination of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about working with water. They were likely outrigger canoes or large sailing rafts, multi-hulled vessels that combined stability with reasonable speed and carrying capacity. These boats could transport not just people, but also the supplies, tools, and equipment necessary for establishing settlements in new lands. But before we explore those epic crossings, we need to understand the world that produced them. The late Pleistocene was a time of dramatic climate change, falling sea levels, and ecological upheaval. It was also a time when human populations were growing and spreading, putting pressure on familiar resources and encouraging exploration of new territories. The people who would eventually cross the waters to Australia were not driven by wanderlust alone, but by the practical necessities of survival in a changing world. They were also inheriting the accumulated wisdom of countless generations of coastal peoples who had slowly, patiently developed the skills and knowledge that made ocean navigation possible. Every technique they used, every material they selected, every navigation method they employed was built on foundations laid by their ancestors. They were not starting from zero, but standing on the shoulders of everyone who had ever ventured onto water before them. And they were about to accomplish something that would change the human story forever. They were about to prove that no body of water, no matter how wide or treacherous, could permanently separate human communities. They were about to demonstrate that the Earth's oceans were not barriers but highways, connecting rather than dividing the continents. In doing so, they would establish patterns of exploration and settlement that continue to influence human behaviour today. But that crossing and the remarkable people who made it possible is where our story truly begins to unfold. The world they inhabited was not the warm, stable planet we know today. Around 70,000 years ago, Earth was locked in the grip of an ice age that had fundamentally reshaped the geography of every continent. Vast ice sheets stretched across northern Europe and North America, trapping so much water that global sea levels had dropped by more than 100 meters below their current position. This was a different planet, with different coastlines, different rivers, and different possibilities. For the communities of Southeast Asia, this transformed world created both opportunities and challenges that would prove crucial to the development of seafaring. The lower sea levels had exposed vast areas of what is now the ocean floor, creating temporary land bridges between many islands and expanding the coastal plains, where human communities lived. At the same time, the complex geography of the region meant that significant water barriers remained, separating clusters of islands and creating natural laboratories where humans could experiment with water-crossing techniques. The Sunda Shelf, a vast underwater plateau that today lies beneath the South China Sea, was largely above water during this period. This created an expanded landmass that connected what are now separate islands into a more unified territory. But even with these land bridges, the region remained a complex maze of waterways, straits, and channels that could only be crossed by water. This geography was perfect for the gradual development of maritime skills. Communities could practice their techniques in relatively protected waters, learning to handle their craft in different conditions while never being too far from familiar territory. Short crossings between nearby islands allowed for the accumulation of experience and the refinement of techniques without the extreme risks that longer ocean voyages would later require. The climate of the region during this period was also conducive to maritime development. While much of the world was experiencing harsh glacial conditions, Southeast Asia remained tropical, with predictable seasonal patterns driven by monsoon systems. These patterns created reliable windows of favourable weather for water travel, times when winds were steady and seas were relatively calm. Experienced navigators could learn to time their journeys to take advantage of these conditions. The marine environment itself was incredibly rich, providing both motivation and reward for those willing to venture onto the water. The warm, shallow seas around the expanded land masses supported diverse ecosystems teeming with fish, shellfish, sea turtles, and marine mammals. For communities that learned to exploit these resources effectively, the ocean was not just a highway, but a larder, a source of protein that could support larger populations than terrestrial hunting and gathering alone. Archaeological evidence from this period is necessarily limited, since many of the most important sites are now underwater. But what evidence we do have suggests that human communities in Southeast Asia were developing increasingly sophisticated relationships with marine environments. Shell middens from coastal sites show intensive exploitation of marine resources. Stone tools show modifications that suggest they were used for processing fish and shellfish. And the distribution of certain raw materials suggests that some form of water transport was already being used for trade and exchange between islands. The people themselves were anatomically modern humans, indistinguishable from people today in their physical and cognitive capabilities. They had the same capacity for innovation, planning, and cooperation that characterizes our species. What they lacked was precedent. They were working without models, developing techniques and technologies that no human had ever developed before. This process of innovation was probably gradual and cumulative, building on thousands of small discoveries and improvements over many generations. Someone discovered that certain types of bamboo were more buoyant than others. Someone else figured out how to lash poles together in ways that remained secure even when wet. Another person learned to read wind patterns or current flows. Each small advance made the next step possible. The social context was equally important. Developing sophisticated watercraft and navigation techniques required more than individual innovation. It required communities that could support experimentation, that could afford to invest time and resources in projects whose outcomes were uncertain. It required social structures that could organize collective efforts and coordinate complex activities involving multiple people with different skills. These communities were probably relatively small, perhaps a few dozen to a few hundred individuals, but they were cohesive enough to undertake ambitious projects and flexible enough to adapt when circumstances changed. They had developed oral traditions that could preserve and transmit technical knowledge across generations. They had social institutions that could make decisions about resource allocation and risk management. Most importantly, they had the kind of cultural confidence that comes from successfully adapting to challenging environments over long periods of time. The boats they eventually developed were marvels of practical engineering, even if they might seem simple by modern standards. Outrigger canoes, for example, solved the fundamental problem of stability that plagued single-hulled vessels. By attaching lateral floats to the main hull, these designs could remain upright, even in rough conditions, while maintaining the speed and maneuverability of narrow hulls. The engineering principles involved are actually quite sophisticated, requiring an understanding of physics and hydrodynamics that could only have come through extensive experimentation and refinement. Large sailing rafts represented a different approach to the same basic challenges. Instead of trying to make small vessels more stable, these designs achieved seaworthiness through size and redundancy. Multiple logs or bamboo poles lashed together could support substantial loads while remaining afloat even if individual components were damaged. Simple sails made from woven mats or animal skins could harness wind power for propulsion, reducing the physical demands on crews during long voyages. The navigation techniques these early mariners developed were equally sophisticated, though they operated on completely different principles than modern navigation. Without instruments or charts, they had to rely on careful observation of natural phenomena and the accumulation of detailed environmental knowledge. Star positions provided directional guidance, but only if you understood the seasonal changes in stellar patterns and could compensate for the effects of latitude. Wave patterns could indicate the presence of land beyond the horizon, but only if you'd learned to feel the subtle differences between swells generated by different sources. Bird behavior was another crucial source of navigation information. Different species had different flight patterns and feeding behaviors that could provide clues about proximity to land, wind conditions, and seasonal changes. The flight paths of land-based birds returning to roost could point toward islands, even when those islands were too distant to see. The presence of certain seabirds could indicate the location of feeding grounds or breeding colonies associated with particular geographical features. Perhaps most remarkably, these early navigators developed techniques for encoding this complex information in memory using songs, stories, and other mnemonic devices. Navigation knowledge was preserved not in written charts, but in oral traditions that could be passed from generation to generation with remarkable accuracy. These traditions were often integrated with spiritual beliefs and cultural practices, creating multiple layers of meaning that helped ensure their preservation. The development of these sophisticated maritime technologies and techniques did not happen in isolation. They were part of broader cultural changes that were taking place as human communities adapted to the challenges and opportunities of the late Pleistocene world. Population growth was creating pressure on familiar resources. Climate change was altering the availability and distribution of food sources. Competition with other communities may have encouraged exploration of new territories. But beyond these practical considerations, there was something else driving maritime development. Call it curiosity, call it wanderlust, call it the fundamental human compulsion to see what lies beyond the horizon. The same psychological traits that had carried our species out of Africa and across the continents were now turning their attention to the barriers imposed by water. The ocean was no longer seen as the end of the world, but as another frontier to be explored and mastered. This shift in perspective was crucial because it meant that maritime development was driven not just by necessity, but by possibility. Communities that had mastered basic water transport began to see distant islands not as unreachable territories, but as potential destinations. The horizon, instead of marking the limit of the known world, began to suggest opportunities that lay beyond it. The stage was set for something unprecedented in human history. For the first time, communities possessed both the technological capabilities and the cultural confidence necessary to attempt crossings of open ocean toward destinations that existed more in hope than in certainty. They had developed boats capable of carrying founder populations across significant distances. They had navigation techniques that could guide them across featureless water. They had the social organization necessary to plan and execute complex voyages, and they had the courage to risk everything on the possibility that there was habitable land somewhere beyond the visible horizon. What they were about to accomplish would prove that no body of water, no matter how wide or treacherous, could permanently separate human communities. They were about to demonstrate that the barriers imposed by geography were temporary challenges rather than permanent limitations. And in doing so, they would establish humanity as the first truly global species, capable of reaching and settling every habitable place on the planet. The crossing they were preparing for would take them to a continent that had been isolated for millions of years, a land where evolution had followed paths impossible anywhere else on Earth. It was a destination that would test every skill they had developed and every assumption they had made about what it meant to be human in a world that seemed infinite in its possibilities and dangers. The journey they were contemplating was unlike anything attempted in human history, not just because of the distance, though that was daunting enough, but because of what lay at the end of it. The continent we now call Australia had been drifting in isolation for over 40 million years, long enough for evolution to conduct experiments impossible anywhere else on Earth. The animals that lived there followed rules that contradicted everything these early sailors might have expected from their experience with life elsewhere. When the first humans finally set foot on Australian shores, sometime around 50,000 years ago, they entered a world that must have seemed like a fever dream. Here were marsupials the size of rhinoceroses, birds that stood taller than grown men, and reptilian predators that dwarfed anything their ancestors had encountered in Africa or Asia. This was not just a new continent, it was a new category of place altogether. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before anyone could encounter giant wombats or flightless thunderbirds, they had to accomplish something that required a different kind of courage entirely. They had to look across an expanse of water wider than any their species had ever crossed and decide that it was not impossible, but merely difficult. They had to build boats capable of carrying not just explorers, but entire founder populations. And they had to develop the navigation skills necessary to find a continent they had never seen, using techniques that had never been tested over such distances. The water barrier between the Southeast Asian islands and Australia was formidable even during the Ice Age when sea levels were at their lowest. The channel that separated the two regions, now known as the Wallace Line, after the naturalist who recognized its biological significance, represented a deep oceanic trench that had never been bridged by land, even when vast areas of the continental shelves were exposed. The minimum distance was around 90 kilometers of open water, but depending on the route taken and the exact departure point, the crossing could be much longer. 90 kilometers might not sound like much in our age of powered vessels and satellite navigation, but for people traveling in outrigger canoes or bamboo rafts, it represented several days of exposure to the open ocean with no possibility of shelter or resupply. Weather could change rapidly. Currents could carry vessels far from their intended course. Navigation errors could lead expeditions into the vast emptiness of the Pacific, with no hope of finding land before supplies ran out. The boats that made these crossings were probably larger and more robust than the coastal craft that had been used for shorter journeys between nearby islands. They needed to carry not just people, but also food, water, tools, and everything necessary for establishing settlements in unknown territory. Archaeological evidence suggests they were likely catamarans or large outrigger canoes with multiple hulls connected by platforms that could support substantial loads while maintaining stability in rough seas. Building such vessels required community effort and specialized knowledge that had been accumulating for generations. The hulls needed to be carefully shaped and sealed to remain watertight during extended exposure to salt water. The connecting platforms had to be strong enough to carry heavy loads, but flexible enough to withstand the stresses of ocean travel. Sails, if used, needed to be woven from appropriate materials and rigged to handle varying wind conditions without overwhelming the vessel's capacity to remain stable. The social organization required for these expeditions was equally sophisticated. Ocean crossings could not be attempted by small family groups or individual adventurers. They required crews with complementary skills, careful planning of supplies and equipment, and decision-making processes that could function under the stress of extended periods at sea. The expeditions probably included experienced navigators, skilled boat handlers, expert hunters and gatherers, and individuals with the knowledge necessary for establishing viable settlements in unfamiliar environments. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of these early ocean crossings was not their technical sophistication, but their psychological dimension. The people who attempted these voyages were venturing into a realm of experience for which evolution had not prepared them. Humans are terrestrial mammals with deeply ingrained instincts for solid ground and familiar surroundings. Everything about extended ocean travel goes against our biological programming. The sensory environment of the open ocean is alien to terrestrial creatures. The constant motion of the vessel, the absence of stable reference points, the way sounds travel differently across water, all combine to create a disorienting experience that can be deeply unsettling even for experienced mariners. Add to this the psychological pressure of knowing that you are completely dependent on fragile technology in an environment where mistakes can be fatal, and the courage required for these early crossings becomes almost incomprehensible. Yet somehow, groups of early humans found the resolve not just to attempt these crossings, but to succeed at them repeatedly. The genetic evidence makes it clear that the colonization of Australia was not a single lucky accident, but a sustained process involving multiple successful voyages over an extended period. Different groups reached different parts of the continent, establishing founder populations that would eventually spread throughout this vast landmass. The navigation techniques that made these crossings possible were probably based on careful observation of natural phenomena rather than any kind of instruments or charts. Star positions could provide directional guidance, but navigating by celestial observation requires detailed knowledge of seasonal changes in stellar patterns and the ability to compensate for the effects of latitude. Wave patterns could indicate the presence of land beyond the horizon, but only if navigators had learned to distinguish between swells generated by different sources and to feel the subtle changes that might indicate the proximity of unseen shores. Bird behavior provided another source of navigation information, though interpreting it correctly required extensive knowledge of different species and their behavioral patterns. Land-based birds returning to roost could point toward islands, even when those islands were too distant to see. The presence of certain seabirds could indicate proximity to feeding grounds or breeding colonies associated with particular geographical features. Even the colour and clarity of water could provide clues about depth, currents, and proximity to land. Perhaps most importantly, these early navigators had to develop techniques for maintaining course and orientation during extended periods when no land was visible in any direction. This required not just technical skills, but psychological resilience, the ability to maintain confidence in your navigation techniques even when surrounded by nothing but water and sky. It required trust in accumulated knowledge and collective wisdom, even when individual experience provided no confirmation that you were heading in the right direction. The successful completion of these crossings represented more than just a transportation achievement. It marked the moment when humans became truly global, capable of reaching any habitable place on the planet, regardless of the water barriers that might separate it from other land masses. The techniques and technologies developed for the Australian crossings would eventually enable the colonization of islands throughout the Pacific, carrying human communities to some of the most remote places on Earth. But the immediate impact was on the continent itself and on the people who had successfully reached it. Australia, in 50,000 years ago, was not an empty land waiting for human arrival. It was a fully functioning ecosystem that had been developing in isolation for millions of years, populated by creatures that had evolved without any experience of human predators or competitors. The encounter between these naive fauna and the newly arrived humans would reshape the entire continent in ways that are still visible today. The largest of the Australian animals were truly extraordinary by any standard. Diprotodon, a marsupial herbivore the size of a modern rhinoceros, grazed in herds across the continent's grasslands. Megalania, a monitor lizard that could grow to lengths of over 6 meters, was an apex predator capable of taking down prey much larger than itself. Genyornis, a flightless bird that stood over 2 meters tall, occupied ecological niches filled by very different creatures on other continents. These animals had no evolutionary experience with human hunting techniques or human-modified landscapes. They showed no fear of the small bipedal creatures that began appearing in their territories. They had no behavioral adaptations for avoiding human predators or competing with human communities for resources. In evolutionary terms, they were sitting ducks, completely unprepared for the arrival of a new kind of predator that used fire, tools, and coordinated hunting strategies. The encounter between humans and Australia's megafauna was not a fair fight, but it was also not a simple story of aggressive overhunting. The evidence suggests that human impacts were both direct and indirect, involving not just active hunting but also habitat modification through the use of fire. Aboriginal Australians developed sophisticated fire management techniques that allowed them to modify entire landscapes to their advantage, creating mosaic patterns of burned and unburned areas that encouraged certain types of vegetation while discouraging others. These fire management practices probably had profound effects on the large herbivores that had evolved to exploit the dense forests and woodlands that had previously characterized much of the continent. As human burning created more open landscapes with different vegetation communities, the habitat requirements of many megafaunal species were no longer met. Animals that had thrived in closed forest environments found themselves increasingly confined to smaller and smaller refuges. The process of megafaunal extinction was probably gradual rather than sudden, unfolding over several thousand years. As human populations grew and spread across the continent, different species probably disappeared at different times and for different reasons. Some may have been hunted to extinction directly. Others may have succumbed to habitat loss or competition with smaller species that were better adapted to human-modified landscapes, Still others may have been victims of introduced diseases or simply unable to maintain viable breeding populations as their ranges became increasingly fragmented. The scale of this transformation was unprecedented in human history. Within a few thousand years of human arrival, most animals weighing more than 40 kilograms had disappeared from Australia. Entire ecological relationships that had existed for millions of years were severed. The continent's ecosystems were restructured around smaller species that were better able to coexist with human communities and human-modified landscapes. But this ecological transformation was not just something that happened to Australia, it was also something that changed the humans who caused it. For the first time in our species' history, human communities found themselves in the position of being the dominant large animals in their environment. There were no significant competitors or predators to constrain human activities. No large carnivores posed serious threats to human settlements. No other species competed effectively for the same resources that humans needed. This ecological dominance had profound implications for human cultural development. In most environments, human societies must constantly negotiate their position in complex food webs that include numerous other large species. They must remain vigilant about predators, competitive about resources, and adaptive to the activities of other animals that can significantly impact human welfare. In post-megafaunal Australia, these constraints were largely removed. The absence of large game animals also forced Aboriginal Australian communities to develop subsistence strategies based on smaller, more distributed resources. Instead of organising their lives around occasional large kills that could feed many people for extended periods, they had to develop techniques for efficiently exploiting smaller animals, marine resources, and plant foods. This encouraged the development of more intensive foraging techniques, more detailed ecological knowledge, and more sophisticated resource management practices. The social implications were equally significant. Large game hunting typically requires coordination among multiple individuals and tends to reinforce certain kinds of social organisation, particularly those that emphasize cooperation among adult males. The shift away from large game hunting may have led to changes in social structure, gender roles, and the organisation of labour that would characterise Aboriginal Australian societies for tens of thousands of years. The abundance of resources that characterised Australia, even after the megafaunal extinctions, may have reduced some of the competitive pressures that drive cultural change in other environments. Without the need to constantly innovate in response to environmental challenges or competition with other species, Aboriginal Australian societies may have had the luxury of developing cultural systems that emphasised stability and continuity rather than rapid change and technological advancement. This is not to suggest that Aboriginal Australian cultures were static or unchanging. Archaeological evidence shows continued innovation in tool technologies, artistic expression, and social organisation throughout the tens of thousands of years following initial colonisation. But the changes tended to be gradual and cumulative rather than revolutionary, building on established foundations rather than replacing them entirely. The transformation of Australia following human arrival also established patterns that would be repeated throughout the world as human communities encountered naive fauna on other continents and islands. Similar waves of extinction would follow human colonisation of the Americas, Madagascar, and islands throughout the Pacific. The Australian experience was not unique, but it was the first large-scale example of the ecological impacts that follow when an innovative predator encounters prey species that have not co-evolved with human hunting pressure. By 30,000 years ago, the transformation of Australia was largely complete. The continent had been reshaped into something entirely new, an ecosystem dominated by humans and the species that could successfully coexist with human communities. The giant marsupials and flightless birds that had once defined Australian fauna were gone, replaced by smaller species and by the humans who had become the continent's new megafauna. The success of human colonization in Australia demonstrated something profound about our species' adaptability and impact. It showed that humans could not only reach the most isolated places on Earth, but could also establish thriving communities in environments completely different from those where our species had evolved. It proved that human cultural adaptations could overcome biological limitations, allowing tropical species to succeed in temperate environments and terrestrial mammals to master oceanic travel. But it also demonstrated the transformative power of human presence in previously uncolonized environments. The Australia that Aboriginal communities called home for tens of thousands of years was not the Australia that had existed before human arrival. It was something new, shaped by the interaction between human intentions and ecological possibilities, between cultural innovations and environmental constraints. The story of Australia's colonisation and transformation provides crucial insights into the relationship between human expansion and environmental change. It shows both the remarkable capabilities of human communities and the profound responsibilities that come with those capabilities. It reminds us that human arrival in new environments is never just a matter of transportation or settlement, but always involves complex ecological relationships with consequences that can persist for millennia. Standing on Australian shores today, looking out at waters that were first crossed by humans 50,000 years ago, we are witnessing the legacy of one of the most remarkable achievements in human history. Not just the technical feat of ocean navigation or the courage required for such an unprecedented journey, but the successful establishment of human communities in a completely alien environment and their adaptation to life in a world unlike anywhere humans had ever lived before. The first Australians didn't just survive in their transformed continent, they thrived, and in doing so, they developed something that hadn't existed anywhere else in the world, a truly maritime civilization. Not maritime in the sense of grand naval empires or merchant fleets, but in something deeper. They became a people for whom water was not an obstacle, but an extension of home. By 40,000 years ago, Aboriginal communities had spread along virtually every coastline of their new continent. But this wasn't just a matter of walking along beaches until you'd covered all the territory. The Australian coast is vast and complex, broken by countless bays, inlets, and offshore islands. Much of it could only be accessed by water. The communities that settled these areas had to maintain their seafaring skills, not just as a historical curiosity, but as a daily necessity. This created something unprecedented in human experience. Children who grew up as comfortable in water as on land. Adults who thought of tides and currents as naturally as they thought of seasons and weather. Communities whose entire cultural identity was built around the rhythm of coastal life, where the distinction between terrestrial and marine resources was largely meaningless because both were simply parts of a unified ecosystem that humans had learned to read and manage. The boats these communities developed were perfectly adapted to their environment and needs. They didn't need vessels capable of crossing oceans because the oceans had already been crossed. Instead, they needed craft that could handle the daily demands of coastal life, fishing boats that could be launched quickly when conditions were right, transport vessels that could carry families and their possessions between seasonal camps, specialized craft for different types of marine hunting. Archaeological evidence for these boats is limited because watercraft made from organic materials rarely survive in tropical environments for tens of thousands of years, but we can infer their sophistication from other types of evidence. The remains of deep-water fish found at inland sites indicating that people were venturing far from shore to reach productive fishing grounds. The distribution of marine shells and other coastal materials at sites hundreds of kilometres inland, suggesting extensive trade networks that depended on water transport. the rapid colonization of offshore islands, some of which could only be reached by water even during periods of low sea level. Perhaps most telling is the evidence for what didn't happen. In most parts of the world where human communities have lived near water for extended periods, there's archaeological evidence of gradual technological development, simple rafts giving way to more sophisticated boats, basic navigation techniques evolving into complex systems. In Australia, by contrast, the archaeological record suggests that sophisticated maritime technologies appeared relatively early and then remain. This pattern is consistent with communities that had already stable for thousands of years, mastered the fundamental challenges of their environment, and had developed technologies that worked so well there was little pressure to change them. The fishing techniques these communities developed were equally sophisticated. Instead of the opportunistic exploitation of marine resources that characterises most early coastal peoples, Aboriginal Australians developed systematic methods for harvesting the sea that could support large populations year-round. Fish traps, built in tidal areas, could capture tons of fish during seasonal runs. Elaborate net systems could harvest schooling species with remarkable efficiency. Specialized techniques for hunting marine mammals, sea turtles, and large fish allowed exploitation of resources that were difficult to access with simpler methods. These weren't just individual techniques but integrated systems that required community coordination and long-term planning. Building large fish traps required collective labor and shared maintenance. Operating net systems required crews with complementary skills and carefully coordinated timing. The knowledge required for successful marine hunting had to be transmitted across generations through formal teaching and practical apprenticeship. The social organization that developed around these maritime activities was equally complex. Different communities specialized in different types of marine exploitation, creating opportunities for trade and exchange. Some groups became known for their skill in deep-water fishing. Marine animals like dugongs or sea developed expertise in hunting. Large others specialized in collecting particular types of shellfish or seaweed. Still others, turtles. This specialization created networks of interdependence that connected communities across vast distances. A group that excelled at producing certain types of fishing equipment might trade their products for specialized foods or raw materials that were only available in other regions. Communities with access to productive fishing grounds might exchange their surplus catch for manufactured goods or ceremonial objects produced elsewhere. These trading networks were maintained through regular voyages that connected communities separated by hundreds of kilometers of coastline. The boats that carried these trading expeditions were probably larger and more seaworthy than the vessels used for daily fishing activities. They needed to carry substantial loads of trade goods while remaining stable in the variable conditions encountered during long coastal voyages. The navigation techniques required for these trading voyages were probably quite sophisticated, though they operated on different principles than modern navigation methods. Without instruments or charts, Aboriginal navigators had to rely on detailed knowledge of coastal features, current patterns, and seasonal weather changes. They developed mental maps that encoded information about safe harbours, reliable water sources, and the locations of different communities along extended stretches of coastline. This navigation knowledge was probably preserved in oral traditions that served multiple functions simultaneously. The same songs or stories that provided practical guidance for navigation also carried cultural information about the relationships between different communities, the history of trading partnerships, and the ceremonial obligations associated with particular routes or destinations. The linguistic evidence supports the idea that these maritime communities developed sophisticated technical vocabularies for describing oceanic phenomena. Aboriginal languages from coastal regions contain hundreds of terms for different types of waves, wind conditions, tidal patterns, and marine life. This linguistic richness reflects not just casual familiarity with marine environments, but deep systematic knowledge that could only have developed through generations of intensive interaction with oceanic systems. The artistic traditions that developed in these maritime communities also reflect their unique relationship with water. Rock art sites along the Australian coast contain thousands of images depicting marine life, boats, and fishing activities. Some of these artistic traditions appear to be very ancient, possibly dating back tens of thousands of years. Others show clear evidence of development and change over time, suggesting that artistic expression evolved along with other aspects of maritime culture. The ceremonial life of maritime communities was similarly influenced by their oceanic orientation. Many Aboriginal cultures include elaborate ceremonies associated with seasonal changes in marine resources, the initiation of young people into maritime activities, and the maintenance of relationships with spiritual beings associated with particular bodies of water. These ceremonies served not just religious functions but also practical ones, providing occasions for the transmission of technical knowledge and the coordination of community activities. Perhaps most remarkably, the maritime orientation of these communities influenced their understanding of space and geography in fundamental ways. Where terrestrial peoples typically think of their territory in terms of boundaries and discrete areas, maritime peoples develop more fluid concepts of space that reflect the interconnected nature of oceanic systems. The same body of water that separates two land areas can also connect them, depending on your perspective and capabilities. This maritime consciousness probably influenced Aboriginal Australian concepts of identity and belonging in ways that were quite different from purely terrestrial cultures. Communities were defined not just by the land they occupied, but by the waters they navigated. Territorial boundaries were not just lines drawn on land, but included complex relationships with particular bodies of water, fishing grounds, and navigation routes. The seasonal movements of maritime communities also followed different patterns than those typical of terrestrial hunter-gatherers. Instead of moving primarily in response to the availability of land-based resources, they coordinated their movements with tidal cycles, fish migrations, and seasonal changes in marine productivity. This created annual cycles that were more complex and more precisely timed than those found in most other hunter-gatherer societies. By 20,000 years ago, the maritime adaptation of Aboriginal Australian communities had reached a level of sophistication that wouldn't be matched elsewhere in the world for tens of thousands of years. These were people who had solved not just the technical challenges of ocean navigation, but the social and cultural challenges of building entire civilizations around intimate relationships with marine environments. They had developed sustainable methods for exploiting marine resources that could support substantial populations without degrading the ecosystems they depended on. They had created social institutions that could coordinate complex maritime activities and maintain trading relationships across vast distances. They had established cultural traditions that preserved and transmitted the knowledge necessary for successful life in oceanic environments. Most importantly, they had demonstrated that human communities could develop forms of organization and identity that were fundamentally different from those that had evolved in purely terrestrial contexts. They proved that water didn't have to be a barrier between communities but could become the medium for their connection. They showed that maritime skills weren't just useful techniques, but could become the foundation for entire ways of life. The legacy of these maritime communities extends far beyond Australia itself. The navigation techniques, boat technologies, and social innovations they developed would eventually spread throughout the Pacific, enabling the colonization of islands as remote as Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. The principles of ocean navigation, sustainable marine resource management, and water-based community organization that they pioneered would influence maritime cultures throughout the world. But perhaps their most important contribution was conceptual rather than technical. They established the idea that humans could be truly amphibious, equally at home on land and water. They proved that the boundaries between terrestrial and marine environments were permeable, that human communities could develop forms of life that transcended the limitations typically imposed by environmental categories. This conceptual breakthrough had implications that extended far beyond maritime contexts. It demonstrated that human adaptability was not limited by the environments where our species had evolved, that cultural innovations could overcome biological constraints, that human communities could successfully establish themselves in any environment where life was possible. The maritime civilizations of ancient Australia were not just successful adaptations to oceanic environments. They were proofs of concept for human flexibility and creativity. They showed that our species was not constrained by evolutionary history, but could reinvent itself as circumstances required. They established patterns of innovation and adaptation that would characterize human expansion for tens of thousands of years. Standing on any Australian beach today, watching fishing boats head out toward waters that have been navigated by humans for 50,000 years, we are witnessing the continuation of one of the longest and most successful experiments in human adaptation ever attempted. The techniques have been updated, the technologies have been modernized, but the fundamental relationship between human communities and marine environments that was established by the first Australians continues to evolve and flourish. Their achievement was not just reaching a distant continent or establishing viable settlements in an alien environment. It was proving that humans could become native to any place where they chose to make their home. That adaptation was not just a biological process, but a cultural one, that the boundaries between possible and impossible were far more flexible than anyone had previously imagined. The boats that carried the first humans to Australia didn't just transport people across water, they carried possibilities, innovations, and ways of thinking that would reshape human consciousness forever. They established patterns of exploration and settlement that continue to influence human behaviour today. And they proved something fundamental about our species that remains as true now as it was 50,000 years ago. We are not limited by the boundaries we encounter, but only by our willingness to transcend them. But success in one environment doesn't guarantee success in another. As the last ice age reached its peak around 20,000 years ago, even these master navigators would face challenges that tested every skill they had developed. The world was changing again, and the communities that had spent millennia perfecting their relationship with the sea would need to adapt once more. The transformation was dramatic even by Ice Age standards, as vast continental ice sheets locked away unprecedented amounts of water. Sea levels plunged to depths not seen for hundreds of thousands of years. Coastlines that had been stable for generations suddenly retreated, leaving behind vast expanses of exposed seafloor. Rivers that had flowed reliably to the sea found themselves cutting new channels across the emerging landscape. Islands that had been separated by navigable channels were suddenly connected by dry land. For maritime communities whose entire way of life was built around water, these changes represented more than environmental challenges. They were cultural crises that threatened the foundations of societies that had developed over tens of thousands of years. Fishing grounds that had been exploited for countless generations disappeared as water depths changed. Traditional navigation routes became obsolete as familiar landmarks were submerged or stranded far inland. Coastal settlements found themselves miles from the retreating shoreline, reveals something profound about human adaptability rather than a barn. The response of these communities to such dramatic environmental change, donning their maritime identity, they demonstrated remarkable flexibility in modifying their technologies and strategies to cope with new conditions. Archaeological evidence from this period shows not cultural collapse but innovation. not retreat from maritime activities, but their transformation to meet changing circumstances. One of the most significant adaptations was the development of new types of watercraft suited to different environmental conditions. The boats that had been designed for coastal navigation and offshore fishing were not necessarily optimal for the rivers, lakes, and restricted waterways that became more important as sea levels dropped. Communities began developing lighter, more maneuverable vessels that could be easily portaged between water bodies and could operate effectively in shallow water. These technological innovations reflect a sophisticated understanding of design principles and material properties. Rivercraft needed to be more flexible than ocean-going vessels to handle the varied conditions encountered in inland waterways. They had to be light enough for portage, yet strong enough to withstand the stresses of rapids and rocky bottoms. They required different hull shapes optimized for shallow water rather than ocean swells. The navigation systems that had been developed for ocean travel also had to be completely reconceptualized. Star-based navigation techniques that worked well for ocean crossings were less useful for river travel, where landmarks and local geography were more important than celestial observations. Traditional knowledge of currents and wave patterns had to be supplemented with understanding of river hydraulics and seasonal flood cycles. This period of environmental change probably accelerated innovation in ways that stable conditions never could. Communities that had relied on familiar techniques for generations suddenly found themselves needing to experiment, adapt, and develop new approaches to old problems. The archaeological record from this period shows greater diversity in tool types and manufacturing techniques, suggesting a period of intensive technological experimentation. The social implications of these environmental changes were equally profound. Communities that had been connected by water transport found themselves separated as waterways disappeared. Trading networks that had operated for millennia had to be reorganized or abandoned entirely. Some groups probably lost contact with distant relatives and trading partners as familiar routes became impassable, but the changes also created new opportunities. Land bridges that connected previously separated areas allowed for population movement and cultural exchange that had been impossible when those areas were separated by water. Communities could now walk to places that had previously required dangerous ocean crossings. New territories became accessible for the first time, offering fresh resources and settlement opportunities. The cultural responses to these changes reveal the resilience of maritime traditions even under extreme pressure. Rather than abandoning their water-based identity, many communities seem to have preserved their maritime knowledge and technologies even when they were not immediately useful. Boat-building techniques were maintained through oral tradition. Navigation knowledge was preserved in songs and stories even when there were no long voyages to make. Marine resource exploitation techniques were remembered even in communities that had moved far from the coast. This preservation of maritime culture during periods when it was not practically necessary demonstrates something important about human cultural transmission. Knowledge systems that are deeply embedded in cultural identity can persist even when they are not immediately useful, waiting for environmental conditions that might make them relevant again. This cultural conservatism probably helped communities maintain their adaptive flexibility, keeping alive traditions that would prove valuable when conditions changed again. The period of low sea levels also provided opportunities for cultural consolidation and integration. Communities that had been separated by water barriers could now interact directly, leading to increased cultural exchange and the spread of innovations across previously isolated populations. This probably resulted in greater cultural homogeneity across some regions as local innovations were shared more widely. Archaeological evidence suggests that some communities actually expanded their geographic range during this period, taking advantage of exposed land bridges to colonize areas that had been previously inaccessible. This expansion was not just geographic, but cultural, as communities carried their maritime traditions into new environments and adapted them to local conditions. The most remarkable aspect of this period was what happened when sea levels began to rise again. Rather than struggling to readjust to changing conditions, communities seem to have been ready to re-embrace their maritime lifestyle as soon as water returned to familiar levels. This suggests that maritime cultural traditions had been successfully preserved throughout the period of environmental change, maintained in cultural memory even when they were not immediately practical. The speed with which maritime activities resumed as sea levels rose indicates that these communities had never really abandoned their fundamental identity as water-oriented peoples. They had simply adapted their practices to temporary environmental conditions while maintaining their core cultural orientation toward marine environments. This cultural continuity represents one of the most impressive examples of long-term cultural resilience in human history. The experience of adapting to major climate change also probably strengthened these communities' understanding of environmental variability and the importance of maintaining flexible cultural systems. They learned through direct experience that environmental conditions are not permanent and that successful communities must be prepared to modify their practices while preserving their essential cultural characteristics. The strategies they developed for coping with environmental change had implications that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. Their emphasis on preserving knowledge, even when it was not currently useful, their willingness to experiment with new technologies while maintaining traditional practices, and their ability to maintain cultural identity while adapting to changing conditions all represent approaches to cultural resilience that remain relevant today. By 15,000 years ago, as global climate began to warm and sea levels started their long rise toward modern positions, the maritime communities of Australia had demonstrated something remarkable about human cultural adaptability. They had survived one of the most dramatic periods of environmental change in human history, while maintaining their essential cultural identity and their commitment to water-based ways of life. The knowledge and technologies they had developed during this period of environmental stress would prove valuable as new opportunities emerged. Rising sea levels created new coastlines, new fishing grounds, and new possibilities for water-based transportation and trade. Communities that had preserved their maritime traditions were positioned to take advantage of these opportunities as they arose. More importantly, they had established patterns of cultural resilience that would serve them well in future periods of environmental change. They had learned to distinguish between the essential and the adaptable aspects of their culture, preserving core elements of their identity while remaining flexible about specific practices and techniques. This balance between continuity and change would characterize their responses to environmental challenges for thousands of years to come. The rising waters that marked the end of the Ice Age brought more than just the return of familiar coastlines. They brought validation of cultural strategies that had sustained these communities through their greatest environmental challenge. The boats that had been remembered in stories could be built again. The navigation techniques that had been preserved in songs could be practiced again. The fishing grounds that had been lost could be rediscovered and exploited with renewed understanding. But the returning seas also brought new challenges and opportunities that would test maritime adaptations in different ways. Higher sea levels meant different coastlines, different current patterns, different relationships between land and water. The communities that had successfully adapted to environmental change during the Ice Age would need to adapt again to the transformed world that emerged as the ice melted. The knowledge they had gained during their period of environmental stress would prove invaluable as they faced these new challenges. They had learned that successful adaptation required not just technological innovation, but cultural flexibility. They had discovered that maintaining identity while changing practices was not just possible, but necessary for long-term survival. They had proven that human communities could preserve their essential character while adapting to environmental conditions that seemed to threaten everything they had built. As the Ice Age ended and the modern world began to take shape, the maritime communities of Australia found themselves uniquely prepared for the challenges and opportunities that lay ahead. They possessed not just sophisticated technologies for working with water, but sophisticated cultural systems for adapting to environmental change while preserving the knowledge and traditions that defined their identity. The legacy of their Ice Age experience would influence their development for thousands of years to come, shaping their responses to new environmental challenges and their approaches to cultural innovation. They had learned lessons about resilience and adaptation that would serve them well as the world continued to change around them, as new peoples arrived on their shores, and as they faced challenges that would test every aspect of their remarkable maritime civilization. Their story during the Ice Age demonstrates something profound about human cultural capacity. It shows that communities can maintain their essential identity while adapting to dramatic environmental change. It proves that cultural traditions can be both stable and flexible, preserving important knowledge while remaining responsive to changing circumstances. And it illustrates the remarkable resilience of human societies that have learned to work with rather than against the natural forces that shape their world. The waters that had first carried humans to Australia 50,000 years earlier continued to shape and support their descendants throughout the Ice Age and beyond. Those waters carried more than just people and goods. They carried knowledge, traditions, and ways of understanding the world that had been tested by environmental extremes and proven capable of surviving whatever challenges the future might bring. As the last ice melted and modern sea levels stabilised, the maritime communities of Australia emerged from their greatest environmental challenge, stronger and more adaptable than ever. They had not just survived the Ice Age, they had learned from it, adapted to it, and emerged from it with enhanced understanding of their own capabilities and the environments they called home. The stage was set for the next chapter in their remarkable story, one that would see their maritime traditions spread far beyond Australia to influence cultures throughout the Pacific and beyond. The transformation wasn't gradual. Around 10,000 years ago, as the ice sheets finally surrendered their grip on the world's water, something extraordinary began to unfold. The communities that had spent millennia perfecting their relationship with the sea suddenly found themselves with new neighbours. Not just the familiar coastlines that emerged as waters rose, but people. Other seafaring peoples who had been developing their own maritime traditions in isolation across the Pacific. The Pacific Ocean had never been empty, but it had been vast enough that different communities could develop their own approaches to ocean navigation without ever encountering each other. Now, as post-glacial climate patterns stabilized and populations grew, these separate traditions began to intersect. The result was an explosion of maritime innovation that would reshape the entire Pacific world. Archaeological evidence from this period tells a story of unprecedented cultural exchange. Obsidian from volcanic islands appears in sites thousands of kilometers away. Pottery styles show sudden changes that can only be explained by contact with distant traditions. Most tellingly, the genetic record shows clear evidence of population mixing between groups that had been isolated for thousands of years. This wasn't conquest or replacement. It was something more subtle and ultimately more transformative. Different maritime traditions encountered each other and began to merge, creating hybrid approaches that were more sophisticated than anything that had existed before. Navigation techniques developed in one region were combined with boat-building methods from another. Resource management strategies that had worked in tropical waters were adapted for temperate conditions. The outrigger canoe represents perhaps the best example of this technological fusion. The basic principle of using lateral floats to provide stability had been developed independently in several regions, but the specific design elements that made these craft capable of long ocean voyages emerged from the interaction between different traditions. The hull shapes that provided speed came from one tradition. The rigging systems that could handle variable wind conditions came from another. The materials and construction techniques that provided durability were borrowed from still others. The result was a watercraft technology that was perfectly suited for Pacific conditions, but could never have been developed by any single community working in isolation. These hybrid designs could carry substantial loads across thousands of kilometers of open ocean while remaining light enough for beach launching and maneuverable enough for coastal navigation. They represented the culmination of human understanding of how to work with water rather than against it. The navigation techniques that evolved during this period were equally sophisticated. Different communities had developed different methods for finding their way across featureless ocean. Some had focused on stellar navigation, learning to read the positions of stars and planets with extraordinary precision. Others had specialized in reading wave patterns, developing the ability to detect land beyond the horizon through subtle changes in ocean swells. Still others had become experts at interpreting natural signs like bird behavior and cloud formations. When these different navigation traditions encountered each other, they didn't compete, they combined. The most successful navigators were those who could integrate multiple types of environmental information into comprehensive understanding of oceanic conditions. They learned to use star positions for general direction while relying on wave patterns for precise location. They combined seasonal knowledge of weather patterns with daily observation of immediate conditions. This integration of navigation techniques was preserved in increasingly sophisticated oral traditions that encoded multiple layers of information in single songs or stories. A navigation chant might simultaneously provide information about star positions, seasonal weather patterns, current flows, and the locations of various islands. These traditions were not just practical tools, but works of art that transformed the technical challenge of ocean navigation into cultural expression. The social innovations that emerged during this period were equally remarkable. Long-distance ocean voyaging required forms of organization that could coordinate activities across vast distances and extended time periods. Communities needed to plan expeditions that might take months to complete and involve dozens of people with different specialized skills. They needed to maintain relationships with trading partners separated by thousands of kilometers of ocean. They needed to develop diplomatic protocols for interactions between groups with different languages and cultural practices. These challenges led to the development of increasingly sophisticated political and social institutions. Chiefs or navigational specialists emerged who had the authority to organize major voyaging expeditions. Trading partnerships were formalized through elaborate ceremonial exchanges. Marriage systems were developed that could maintain genetic diversity across scattered island populations while preserving local cultural identities. The religious and spiritual dimensions of ocean voyaging also became more elaborate during this period. The ocean was no longer seen simply as a highway or resource base, but as a living entity with its own spiritual significance. Navigation routes were understood not just as practical pathways, but as sacred journeys that connected communities to ancestral spirits and cosmic forces. Voyaging expeditions became religious pilgrimages as well as economic or political ventures. These spiritual traditions served important practical functions as well as religious ones. They provided additional motivation for preserving navigation knowledge across generations. They created social bonds that could maintain cooperation during the stresses of long ocean voyages. They offered psychological support for people undertaking journeys into environments that remained dangerous despite all technological advances. The artistic traditions that developed around Pacific voyaging were equally sophisticated. Boats became canvases for elaborate decorative schemes that served both aesthetic and practical purposes. The patterns painted on hulls were not just ornamental, but served as identification markers that could be recognized across great distances. The designs carved into paddles and other equipment often encoded navigation information or spiritual protection. Music and dance traditions associated with voyaging became central elements of Pacific cultures. Songs that preserved navigation knowledge were performed during elaborate ceremonies that celebrated successful voyages and prepared crews for upcoming expeditions. Dance traditions that mimicked the movements of boats in various sea conditions served both as entertainment and as training for young navigators. The most remarkable achievement of this period was not any single technological innovation, but the creation of integrated cultural systems that could support sustained ocean exploration and settlement. By 8,000 years ago, Pacific communities had developed all the elements necessary for systematic colonization of even the most remote islands. They had boats capable of carrying founder populations across thousands of kilometers of open ocean. They had navigation techniques accurate enough to find islands that represented tiny targets in vast expanses of water. They had social organizations capable of planning and executing complex multi-generational settlement projects. Most importantly, they had developed cultural traditions that could preserve and transmit this knowledge across generations while remaining flexible enough to adapt to new conditions and challenges. The voyaging traditions that emerged during this period were not rigid technical systems, but living cultural practices that could evolve and improve through continued use and refinement. The success of these integrated systems is visible in the archaeological record of Pacific Island settlement. Beginning around 4,000 years ago, human communities began appearing on islands throughout the central and eastern Pacific. These weren't random discoveries, but systematic colonization efforts that followed logical geographic progressions. Islands were settled in order of accessibility, with each successful colonization providing a base for further exploration. The speed of this expansion was unprecedented in human history. Within just a few thousand years, human communities had established themselves on islands from Hawaii to Easter Island, from New Zealand to the far reaches of Polynesia. Some of these islands were separated by thousands of kilometers of open ocean from their nearest neighbors. Others were so small that missing them by even a few degrees would have meant sailing past into empty ocean with no hope of return. Yet the colonization was successful, not just once but repeatedly. Multiple islands were settled by substantial founder populations that could establish viable breeding communities. Archaeological evidence shows that these settlements were not accidental discoveries by lost voyagers, but planned colonization efforts that carried appropriate supplies, tools, and even livestock for establishing permanent communities. The cultural impact of this expansion was equally remarkable. Despite the vast distances involved, the communities established on different Pacific islands maintained recognizable cultural connections. Languages remained related even across thousands of kilometers of ocean separation. Artistic traditions showed clear family resemblances, despite developing in isolation for centuries. Religious and social practices retained common elements, even as they adapted to local conditions. This cultural coherence across such vast distances demonstrates something profound about the societies that achieved Pacific colonization. They were not just technically capable of long-distance ocean travel, but socially and culturally sophisticated enough to maintain meaningful connections across barriers that would have completely isolated other types of human communities. The agricultural systems that supported Pacific Island communities were equally innovative. Most Pacific islands lacked the terrestrial resources that had supported human communities in continental environments. Island settlers had to develop entirely new approaches to food production that could work in environments with limited land, variable rainfall, and isolation from continental resource bases. The solution was a form of intensive horticulture that maximized productivity from small areas while maintaining long-term sustainability. Root crops like taro and sweet potato were cultivated using sophisticated irrigation and soil management techniques. Tree crops like coconut and breadfruit provided both food and raw materials for construction and manufacturing. Marine resources were exploited using techniques that had been refined over thousands of years of coastal living. These agricultural systems were not just productive, but resilient. They could survive the storms, droughts, and other environmental challenges that regularly affected small islands. They could support population densities that were remarkable for pre-industrial societies. Most importantly, they could be established quickly by small founder populations, allowing successful colonization even when initial settlement groups were quite small. The success of Pacific Island agriculture also demonstrates the importance of biological exchange in human expansion. Island settlers didn't just bring their knowledge and tools, they brought entire biological communities, including food plants, domestic animals, and even soil organisms that were necessary for successful agriculture. This biological colonization was as important as human colonization in establishing viable island communities. The social systems that developed on Pacific Islands were equally adapted to island conditions. Island communities needed to be more cooperative and egalitarian than continental societies because they couldn't rely on trade or migration to solve resource problems. They developed elaborate systems of resource sharing and reciprocal obligation that could maintain social stability even during periods of scarcity. These social innovations were particularly important for maintaining the voyaging traditions that kept island communities connected to the broader Pacific world. Long-distance voyaging was expensive and risky, requiring community investment in boats, supplies, and crew training. Island societies needed to develop institutions that could support these activities even when their immediate practical benefits were not obvious. The result was a unique form of human organization that combined local autonomy with regional integration. Individual islands maintained their own cultural identities and political systems while participating in broader networks of exchange and communication that spanned the entire Pacific. This balance between independence and connection was crucial for the long-term success of Pacific Island societies. By 3,000 years ago, the cultural and technological foundations for Pacific exploration were fully established. Communities throughout the region possessed sophisticated boats, accurate navigation techniques, and social organizations capable of supporting long-distance voyaging. They had developed agricultural systems that could support island populations and cultural traditions that could preserve voyaging knowledge across generations. The stage was set for the final phase of Pacific colonization, the settlement of the most remote and challenging islands in the ocean. This would require pushing voyaging technologies and techniques to their absolute limits, attempting crossings that were longer and more dangerous than any previously accomplished. It would test not just technical capabilities, but cultural resilience, social organization, and individual courage. The communities that would attempt these final voyages were the inheritors of thousands of years of maritime tradition. They possessed knowledge that had been accumulated through countless generations of ocean travelers. They had technologies that represented the culmination of human understanding of how to work with oceanic environments. They had social systems that could support the most ambitious voyaging projects ever attempted, but they also faced challenges that their ancestors could never have imagined. The islands they were seeking were smaller and more remote than any previously settled. The ocean crossings required to reach them were longer than any voyage in human history. The consequences of failure were absolute, with no possibility of rescue or return. The voyages they were contemplating would not just test their technical capabilities, but their understanding of what it meant to be human in a world that seemed to have no limits. They would prove that no distance was too great to cross, no island too remote to reach, no challenge too difficult for human ingenuity and determination to overcome. The success of these final voyages would complete a process that had begun 50,000 years earlier, when the first humans looked across the waters toward Australia and decided that distance was not a permanent barrier, but a temporary challenge. It would establish humanity as truly the first global species, capable of reaching every habitable place on the planet, regardless of the obstacles that might separate it from other human communities. But more than that, it would prove something fundamental about human nature itself, that we are not limited by the circumstances of our birth or the environments where we happen to find ourselves, that we possess the capacity to adapt to any challenge, overcome any barrier, and establish ourselves in any place where life is possible. The final chapter of Pacific exploration would not just be a story of navigation and settlement. It would be a testament to the limitless possibilities of human curiosity, courage, and determination. It would prove that the horizon is not the end of the world, but the beginning of everything that lies beyond it. The quiet revolution that had begun with simple rafts and coastal voyaging had become something magnificent, a demonstration of human capability that continues to inspire exploration and discovery today. From the first tentative ventures into shallow water to the epic crossings that would carry human communities to the remotest corners of the Pacific, the story of seafaring represents one of humanity's greatest achievements, and that story was far from over. The techniques, knowledge, and cultural traditions that had been developed in the Pacific would eventually spread throughout the world's oceans, carrying human communities to every continent and establishing the maritime traditions that continue to connect our global civilization today. The first sailors had not just learned to cross water, they had learned to transform barriers into bridges, distances into connections, and the unknown into the familiar. Their legacy flows through every culture that has ever built a boat, every society that has ever crossed an ocean, every individual who has ever looked toward the horizon and seen not an ending but a beginning. They prove that humans are not terrestrial creatures confined to the land where they were born, but amphibious beings capable of making any environment their home. The story of sailing is ultimately the story of human possibility itself, a reminder that we are limited not by the barriers we encounter, but only by our willingness to transcend them. And as we face new frontiers today, from the depths of the ocean to the reaches of space, we carry with us the same spirit of exploration that first motivated someone 50,000 years ago to push off from a familiar shore and head toward an unknown horizon. The waters had carried them so far, but the greatest test still lay ahead. By 2,000 years ago, Pacific navigators had settled nearly every major island group in their vast ocean world. Yet in the emptiest reaches of the Pacific, where the distances between tiny specks of land stretched beyond anything previously attempted, a few islands remained untouched by human presence. These weren't just remote, they were impossibly remote, separated from their nearest neighbours by expanses of water that dwarfed even the epic crossings that had brought humans to Australia. Easter Island, known to its eventual inhabitants as Rapa Nui, sits in the southeastern Pacific, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. The nearest inhabited land is over 2,000 kilometres away. The nearest continental shore is nearly 4,000 kilometres distant. For anyone attempting to reach it from the populated islands of central Polynesia, it represented a journey into what might as well have been another dimension entirely. Hawaii presented a different, but equally daunting challenge. These islands lay far to the north of the established Polynesian world, separated from the nearest inhabited atolls by over 3,000 kilometers of open ocean. Unlike other Pacific crossings, which generally followed logical stepping stone patterns between visible island chains, the route to Hawaii required navigators to head into empty ocean based on nothing more than subtle environmental cues and accumulated knowledge about oceanic patterns. New Zealand offered perhaps the greatest challenge of all. These large islands lay far to the south and west of the Polynesian heartland, in temperate waters where familiar tropical navigation techniques might not apply. The crossing required not just finding distant land, but adapting to completely different environmental conditions once you arrived. This wasn't just exploration anymore. It was colonization of an entirely different world. The people who would attempt these final crossings weren't desperate refugees or accidental castaways. They were the inheritors of the most sophisticated maritime tradition ever developed, members of communities that had been perfecting oceanic navigation for thousands of years. They possessed technologies and knowledge that represented the absolute pinnacle of pre-industrial seafaring capability. Their boats had evolved far beyond the simple rafts and outrigger canoes of earlier periods. These were ocean-going vessels capable of carrying entire communities across thousands of kilometers of open water. Archaeological evidence and ethnographic studies of similar craft suggest they were probably large double-hulled sailing canoes with sophisticated rigging systems and carefully designed hulls that could maintain speed and stability in the variable conditions encountered during extended ocean voyages. The construction of such vessels required not just technical expertise, but substantial community investment. Building a boat capable of carrying 40 or 50 people, along with all their supplies, tools, and livestock, for establishing a new settlement, was a major undertaking that could take months or even years to complete. It required specialists in hull construction, sail making, rope work, and the countless other skills necessary for creating seaworthy craft. The navigation techniques these final voyagers employed were equally sophisticated. They represented the culmination of thousands of years of accumulated knowledge about reading oceanic environments. These navigators could determine their position and course using star compasses that encoded the movements of dozens of celestial objects throughout the year. They could detect land beyond the horizon by reading wave patterns with extraordinary sensitivity, feeling through the motion of their vessels the subtle changes in ocean swells that indicated the presence of unseen islands. Bird behavior provided another crucial source of navigation information. Different species had different flight ranges and behavioral patterns that could indicate proximity to land, seasonal changes, or the direction of feeding grounds. Cloud formations could reveal the presence of land through subtle changes in color and movement that were invisible to untrained observers. Even the taste and temperature of seawater could provide clues about currents, depth, and distance from shore. Perhaps most remarkably, these navigators had learned to integrate all of these different types of information into comprehensive understanding of oceanic conditions that could guide them across distances that seemed impossible. They didn't rely on any single technique, but combined multiple sources of environmental information into mental models of extraordinary complexity and accuracy. The preservation of this navigation knowledge required social institutions as sophisticated as the techniques themselves. The information necessary for long-distance ocean navigation was too complex and too important to be left to individual memory. It had to be encoded in cultural traditions that could preserve accuracy across generations, while remaining flexible enough to incorporate new discoveries and local adaptations. Navigation schools emerged in some Pacific communities where young people could spend years learning the techniques necessary for long-distance voyaging. These weren't casual apprenticeships, but formal educational systems with structured curricula and rigorous testing. Students learned not just practical navigation techniques, but also the cultural traditions, spiritual practices, and social responsibilities associated with oceanic travel.
Yeah,
The master navigators who led these schools were among the most respected members of their communities. They possessed knowledge that was literally vital to community, survival, and expansion. Their training often began in childhood and continued throughout their adult lives. They were not just technical specialists, but cultural leaders who embodied their community's relationships with the ocean. The decision to attempt voyages to the most remote Pacific islands was never taken lightly. These expeditions represented enormous investments of community resources and involved risks that could result in the complete loss of substantial populations. The planning process probably took years and involved careful consideration of seasonal weather patterns, the selection and training of crews, and the accumulation of supplies for voyages that might last months. The psychological challenges of these voyages were as daunting as the technical ones. Crews had to maintain course and morale during weeks or even months at sea, with no sight of land and no certainty that their destination actually existed. They had to function effectively under conditions of constant motion, salt spray and crowding, while managing the complex tasks of navigation, sail handling, and boat maintenance. The social dynamics of long-distance voyaging required carefully developed institutions for decision-making, conflict resolution, and resource management. Voyaging crews weren't just collections of individuals, but functioning communities that had to maintain cooperation and effectiveness under extraordinary stress. The leadership structures, communication systems, and cultural practices that made this possible were as important as the boats and navigation techniques. The success of these final Pacific voyages was not just a matter of reaching distant islands, but of establishing viable settlements once they arrived. The founder populations had to be large enough and genetically diverse enough to establish breeding communities that could survive in isolation. They had to carry with them not just people, but entire biological and cultural systems necessary for successful colonization. The agricultural packages that supported Pacific Island settlement had been refined through thousands of years of experience. Settlers carried carefully selected varieties of taro, sweet potato, breadfruit, and other crops that could establish productive food systems in new environments. They brought pigs, dogs, and chickens that could provide protein and other resources. They even carried soil samples and beneficial microorganisms that could help establish productive agricultural systems. The cultural knowledge necessary for successful island settlement was equally important. Colonists needed to understand how to establish sustainable resource management systems, how to organize communities that could function effectively in isolation, and how to maintain the cultural traditions that define their identity while adapting to new environmental conditions. The timing of these final Pacific voyages was probably influenced by environmental as well as cultural factors. Climate changes during the late Holocene may have created more favorable conditions for long-distance navigation, while simultaneously putting pressure on established island communities to seek new territories. Population growth in the Central Pacific may have encouraged exploration of previously ignored remote islands. Archaeological evidence suggests that the settlement of Easter Island occurred sometime between 800 and 1200 CE, making it one of the last places on Earth to be colonized by humans. The founding population was probably quite small, perhaps no more than a few dozen individuals, but they successfully established a community that would persist in isolation for over 1,000 years. Hawaii was settled somewhat earlier, probably between 300 and 800 CE, by voyagers who made one of the longest ocean crossings in human history. The success of Hawaiian colonization is particularly remarkable because it required not just finding these distant islands, but establishing agricultural systems in environments quite different from those of tropical Polynesia. New Zealand presented unique challenges that required different solutions. These large temperate islands, supported different ecosystems and required different agricultural techniques than tropical Pacific islands. The Polynesian settlers, who became the ancestors of the Maori people, had to adapt their entire way of life to succeed in this new environment. The colonization of New Zealand also had ecological impacts that were more dramatic than those associated with most Pacific Island settlement. The islands had been isolated for so long that they supported unique fauna, including large flightless birds called moa, and had no native land mammals. The arrival of humans and their associated species led to rapid changes in these ecosystems. The cultural achievements of these final Pacific voyages extended far beyond their immediate practical success. They represented the completion of a process that had begun with the first tentative ventures onto water by coastal peoples thousands of years earlier. They proved that human ingenuity and determination could overcome barriers that seemed absolutely insurmountable. The navigation techniques developed for these voyages represented some of the most sophisticated applications of traditional ecological knowledge ever developed. Pacific navigators achieved levels of precision in ocean wayfinding that wouldn't be matched by European navigators until the development of accurate chronometers in the 18th century. The boats that carried these final expeditions were marvels of practical engineering that demonstrate sophisticated understanding of hydrodynamics, materials science, and structural design. They were perfectly adapted to their intended use, combining seaworthiness with speed, carrying capacity with maneuverability. The social institutions that organized and supported these voyages provide models of collective decision-making and resource management that remain relevant today. They show how human communities can coordinate complex activities requiring long-term planning and substantial risk-taking while maintaining social cohesion and cultural identity. Perhaps most importantly, these final Pacific voyages establish patterns of exploration and settlement that continue to influence human expansion today. The same combination of technological innovation, cultural transmission, and individual courage that carried Polynesian navigators to the remotest corners of the Pacific continues to drive human exploration of new frontiers. The psychological and cultural legacy of Pacific navigation is equally enduring. These voyages demonstrated that distance is not a permanent barrier, but a temporary challenge that can be overcome through appropriate preparation and sufficient determination. They establish the principle that no destination is too remote to reach if you possess the necessary knowledge, technology, and courage. The environmental knowledge that Pacific navigators accumulated through thousands of years of oceanic travel provides insights into natural systems that remain valuable today. Their understanding of weather patterns, current flows, and seasonal changes in oceanic conditions was based on direct observation and practical experience that modern science is still working to fully understand. The integration of practical knowledge with cultural and spiritual traditions that characterize Pacific navigation represents a model for how human societies can maintain meaningful relationships with natural environments while developing sophisticated technologies for working within those environments. Pacific navigators were not just technically competent but culturally embedded in traditions that emphasized respect for natural forces and sustainable use of resources. By 1200 CE, the Great Age of Pacific exploration was essentially complete. Human communities had established themselves on virtually every habitable island in the world's largest ocean. The voyaging traditions that had made this possible continued to function for several more centuries, maintaining connections between distant island communities and preserving the knowledge necessary for long-distance navigation. The arrival of European explorers in the Pacific during the 16th and 17th centuries marked the beginning of a different kind of maritime expansion, one based on different technologies and motivated by different goals. But the achievements of Pacific navigators provided the foundation for much of what Europeans would accomplish. The routes they pioneered, the islands they discovered, and the techniques they developed all contributed to the eventual European mapping and settlements of the Pacific. The cultural disruption that followed European contact led to the decline of traditional navigation practices in many Pacific communities. The knowledge systems that had been preserved for thousands of years were lost within a few generations as communities adopted new technologies and ways of life introduced by European colonization. However, the legacy of Pacific navigation was not entirely lost. In recent decades, there has been renewed interest in traditional wayfinding techniques among Pacific Island communities. Navigator training programs have been established to preserve and transmit traditional knowledge. Replica voyaging canoes have been built using traditional methods and materials. Long-distance voyages have been undertaken using only traditional navigation techniques. These cultural revival efforts have demonstrated that the knowledge systems developed by Pacific navigators remain viable and accurate. Modern voyagers using traditional techniques have successfully completed crossings that rival those of their ancestors, proving that indigenous knowledge systems can be as effective as modern technological approaches. The revival of traditional Pacific navigation has also provided insights into sustainable approaches to ocean travel and resource management. Traditional techniques require minimal external inputs and have minimal environmental impact compared to modern maritime technologies. They represent models for how human societies might develop more sustainable relationships with oceanic environments. The story of Pacific navigation also provides perspective on contemporary challenges facing island communities. Climate change, sea level rise, and environmental degradation threaten many of the same communities whose ancestors achieved some of the most remarkable feats of exploration and adaptation in human history. The resilience and adaptability demonstrated by Pacific navigators may provide guidance for addressing these contemporary challenges. The techniques and knowledge systems that enabled Pacific exploration also offer insights into human cognitive capabilities and cultural transmission. The ability to navigate across thousands of kilometers of open ocean using only traditional techniques demonstrates remarkable applications of spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and environmental observation. The preservation of this knowledge across generations through oral tradition shows the effectiveness of non-literate educational systems. Standing on any Pacific shore today, watching modern vessels follow routes first pioneered by traditional navigators, we are witnessing the continuation of one of humanity's greatest achievements. The courage that first motivated someone to venture beyond the sight of land continues to inspire exploration and discovery. The knowledge systems that guided ancient voyagers across empty ocean continue to inform our understanding of natural environments. The boats may have changed, the instruments may be different, but the fundamental human impulse that drove Pacific exploration remains constant. We are still the species that refuses to accept barriers as permanent, that sees the horizon not as an ending, but as an invitation. The legacy of the first sailors flows through every subsequent achievement in exploration and discovery. From the simple rafts that first carried humans across narrow straits to the sophisticated vessels that completed the colonization of the Pacific, the story of seafaring represents a continuous thread in human development. Each generation built upon the achievements of their predecessors, pushing the boundaries of the possible ever outward, until no ocean remained uncrossed, no habitable shore unreached. The final Pacific voyages represent the culmination of this process, the moment when human maritime capability reached its theoretical limits using traditional technologies. They proved that given sufficient knowledge, appropriate tools, and enough determination, humans could reach any place where life was possible, regardless of the barriers that might separate it from the rest of the world. but they also represent something more profound about human nature itself. They demonstrate our species' capacity for hope, our willingness to risk everything on the possibility that something better lies beyond the horizon, our refusal to accept the boundaries imposed by geography or circumstance. The navigators who guided those final voyages into the empty Pacific weren't just seeking new lands, they were pursuing the limitless possibilities of human potential itself. The ocean that had once represented the absolute boundary of the possible world had become humanity's highway to everywhere. The barriers that had once seemed insurmountable had become bridges connecting all the habitable places on Earth. And in achieving this transformation, the first sailors had proven something that continues to inspire human achievement today: that we are limited not by the challenges we face, but only by our willingness to overcome them. The empty horizon that had once marked the end of everything known had become the gateway to everything possible. And through that gateway, carried by wind and current and human courage, our species had spread to every corner of the world, establishing the global civilization that connects us all today. The first voyage was complete, but the journey would never end. Hello, bored people, and thanks for following this journey from the first tentative push-off from ancient shores to the colonization of the most remote places on Earth. If you've made it this far, you've witnessed one of the most remarkable achievements in human history: the transformation of our species from land-bound foragers to masters of the world's oceans. This story of sailing isn't just about boats and navigation. It's about the fundamental human refusal to accept limits, the courage to trust ourselves to the unknown, and the ingenuity that turns barriers into bridges. If this exploration of our maritime heritage has given you something to think about, helped you fall asleep, or simply provided a break from the noise of daily life, I'd appreciate a like and subscribe. These stories take time to research and craft, and your support helps me continue telling them the way they deserve to be told, with patience, accuracy, and respect for the remarkable people who lived them. I'm curious about how these longer-form videos fit into your life. Are you listening while working, falling asleep to them, or maybe cooking dinner while learning about our shared human story? Let me know in the comments. There's something special about knowing these stories are reaching people around the world, connecting us across the same oceans. Our ancestors learned to navigate thousands of years ago. And as always, stay curious, stay calm. Until next time, remember that every time you see the horizon, you're looking at the same line that called to the first sailors and continues to call to explorers today. The journey never really ends. The techniques and knowledge that carried humans across the Pacific didn't vanish when those epic voyages ended. They evolved, adapted, and spread, becoming the foundation for every maritime tradition that followed. By the time European explorers began their own age of oceanic discovery in the 15th and 16th centuries, they were following routes and using principles that had been pioneered thousands of years earlier by navigators whose names we'll never know. The irony is almost poetic. Columbus, seeking a western route to the Indies, was attempting a crossing that Pacific peoples had been making routinely for over a millennium. Magellan, celebrated for the first circumnavigation of the globe, was completing a journey that indigenous navigators had already accomplished in pieces, island by island, across generations of patient exploration. But European maritime expansion brought something different to the equation. Not better seamanship necessarily, but different motivations. Where Pacific navigators had moved across the ocean to find new homes, European explorers moved to find new wealth. Where traditional voyagers had sought empty islands to settle, European expeditions sought populated lands to exploit. The shift from exploration as settlement to exploration as extraction would reshape not just the oceans, but the entire world. The technological convergence was fascinating to witness. European shipbuilders had developed different solutions to the same fundamental problems of ocean travel. Instead of outrigger canoes, they built deep-keeled sailing ships. Instead of reading wave patterns and bird flight, they used magnetic compasses and celestial instruments. Instead of preserving navigation knowledge in songs and stories, they drew it on charts and wrote it in logbooks. Yet the basic principles remained the same. You still had to understand wind and current. You still had to maintain your vessel in hostile conditions. You still had to find your way across featureless water toward destinations that might exist only in hope. The tools had changed, but the fundamental challenge of trusting yourself to the ocean remained as daunting as ever. The encounter between these different maritime traditions created something unprecedented in human history. For the first time, the world's oceans became a single, connected system rather than separate regional networks. Trade routes that had operated independently for thousands of years suddenly intersected. Goods, ideas, and unfortunately, diseases began moving between continents that had been isolated since the last ice age. A century of Columbus's first voyage, Spanish of this transformation, was breathtaking. Within treasure fleets were carrying New World silver across the Pacific to China, where it was traded for silk and spices that made their way back to Europe via routes pioneered by Portuguese navigators around Africa. The world had become a single economic system, connected entirely by water, but this integration came at enormous cost. The indigenous peoples of the Americas, who had been isolated from Old World diseases for over 10,000 years, faced catastrophic epidemics that killed up to 90% of their population within a few generations. Entire civilizations that had developed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, architectural techniques, and agricultural systems were swept away by smallpox, measles, and typhus. The ecological impacts were equally dramatic. European colonization brought new plants and animals to every continent, often with devastating effects on native species that had no evolutionary experience with these introduced competitors and predators. The passenger pigeon, once the most abundant bird in North America, was extinct within 3 centuries of European arrival. The great auk, which had survived ice ages and climate changes, was hunted to extinction for its feathers and oil. The transformation wasn't entirely one-sided. European agriculture was revolutionized by crops from the Americas. Potatoes from the Andes became the staple food of Ireland and much of northern Europe. Maize from Mexico spread across Africa and Asia, supporting population growth that wouldn't have been possible with traditional crops alone. Tomatoes, peppers, and countless other New World plants became integral parts of cuisines from Italy to India. The cultural exchange was equally profound, though often hidden beneath the surface of colonial dominance. European navigation techniques were influenced by indigenous knowledge, wherever they encountered sophisticated local traditions. The astronomical observations that enabled precise longitude calculation, built upon mathematical traditions, developed independently in multiple cultures. Even the concept of the world as a sphere, which seemed so fundamental to European exploration, had been understood by various indigenous astronomers long before European contact. The environmental knowledge that indigenous peoples had accumulated over thousands of years of intimate relationship with their local ecosystems proved invaluable to European colonists, even when that relationship was characterized by exploitation rather than partnership. Native Americans taught Europeans which plants were edible, which provided medicine, and which could be used for materials. Without this knowledge, many colonial settlements would have failed entirely. The maritime technologies that emerged from this global convergence were more sophisticated than anything previously developed. The great age of sail that dominated ocean travel from the 16th to 19th centuries represented a synthesis of techniques and knowledge from every maritime tradition on Earth. The ships that carried this synthesis were marvels of practical engineering that could cross any ocean, survive any storm, and carry cargoes that connected the most distant corners of the world. Yet something was lost in this transformation. The intimate knowledge of local ocean conditions that had characterized traditional navigation was replaced by standardized techniques that worked everywhere but understood nowhere completely. The deep spiritual relationship with the sea that had characterized indigenous maritime cultures was replaced by a more instrumental approach that saw the ocean primarily as a highway for commerce and conquest. The social structures that had supported traditional voyaging were also transformed. Where Pacific navigation had been a community endeavour requiring collective decision-making and shared risk, European maritime expansion became increasingly dominated by commercial and military hierarchies. Ships' crews were no longer extended families or clan groups, but collections of individuals bound together primarily by wages and discipline. The environmental consequences of this shift toward large-scale commercial shipping were profound. The whale populations that had sustained indigenous Arctic peoples for thousands of years were decimated within decades by industrial whaling operations. The cod fisheries that had supported North Atlantic communities since the end of the Ice Age collapsed under the pressure of increasingly intensive harvesting techniques. The transformation of maritime culture also affected the way humans understood their relationship with the natural world. Traditional navigators had seen themselves as participants in oceanic systems, reading natural patterns and working with rather than against environmental forces. The new maritime culture increasingly emphasized human dominance over nature, using technology to overcome environmental challenges rather than adapting to environmental realities. This shift in consciousness had implications that extended far beyond maritime contexts. The same instrumental approach to natural resources that characterized colonial maritime expansion became the foundation for industrial development on land. The idea that nature existed primarily to serve human purposes, rather than as a complex system of which humans were merely one part, became deeply embedded in European and eventually global culture. The scientific revolution that accompanied maritime expansion also transformed human understanding of oceanic systems. The careful observation and systematic recording that characterized European navigation led to increasingly sophisticated knowledge of global weather patterns, ocean currents, and seasonal variations. This scientific approach to understanding marine environments eventually produced more accurate and comprehensive knowledge than traditional techniques had provided. Yet this scientific knowledge was often disconnected from the practical wisdom that traditional navigators had developed through direct experience. European charts could show the position of every reef and the direction of every current, but they couldn't convey the subtle environmental cues that experienced indigenous navigators used to predict weather changes or detect the presence of land beyond the horizon. The military applications of maritime technology became increasingly dominant as European powers competed for control of global trade routes. The great naval battles of the Age of Sail were fought not just for territory or resources, but for control of the ocean highways that connected the emerging global economy. The ability to project military power across vast distances became one of the defining characteristics of European imperial expansion. The development of increasingly powerful naval weapons transformed the ocean from a realm of exploration and trade into a theatre of warfare. The same waters that had carried peaceful trading expeditions and migration voyages became battlefields where competing empires fought for dominance. The romance of sail was increasingly overshadowed by the grim realities of naval combat and maritime blockade. The social changes that accompanied maritime expansion were equally profound. Port cities became cosmopolitan centres where people from different continents encountered each other, sometimes peacefully, often violently. These urban centres developed their own distinctive cultures that blended elements from multiple traditions while serving the needs of global commerce. The crews that manned the ships of global commerce were themselves products of this cultural mixing. Sailors from every maritime tradition worked together on vessels that might visit dozens of ports in the course of a single voyage. This created a distinctive maritime culture that was truly international, with its own language, customs, and social structures that transcended national boundaries. The economic structures that emerged from maritime expansion also transformed human society in fundamental ways. The concentration of wealth that resulted from controlling global trade routes created new forms of inequality that differed from traditional patterns based on land ownership or political authority. Merchant families could accumulate fortunes that rivaled those of kings, while the sailors who made their wealth possible often lived in poverty and danger. The environmental knowledge that accumulated through centuries of global maritime activity eventually became the foundation for modern oceanographic science. The systematic collection of data on currents, temperatures, and weather patterns by generations of navigators created databases that scientists could use to understand oceanic systems on a global scale. This scientific understanding of ocean systems eventually led to more efficient and safer navigation techniques, but it also enabled more intensive exploitation of marine resources. The same knowledge that made global commerce possible also made possible the industrial fishing operations that would eventually threaten the sustainability of ocean ecosystems. The cultural legacy of the Great Age of Sail extends far beyond its immediate historical impact. The stories, songs, and traditions that developed around maritime expansion became central elements of national mythologies in many countries. The image of the intrepid explorer setting out across unknown seas became a powerful symbol of human courage and determination. Yet this mythologizing often obscured the darker aspects of maritime expansion. The slave ships that carried millions of Africans to the Americas were products of the same maritime technologies and knowledge systems that enabled exploration and trade. The diseases that devastated indigenous populations were spread by the same networks of global connection that brought new ideas and opportunities to other parts of the world. The transformation of the world's oceans from barriers into highways had profound implications for human consciousness and identity. For the first time in history, it became possible for individuals to have direct personal experience of the entire planet. Sailors could visit every continent, experience every climate, and encounter every type of human society within the span of a single career. This global perspective gradually spread beyond the maritime community as improved transportation and communication made it possible for information to flow rapidly between distant parts of the world. The Age of Sail was also the beginning of the Age of Global Awareness, when humans began to understand themselves as members of a single species sharing a single planet. The technological innovations that emerged from maritime expansion also had applications far beyond ocean travel. The precision manufacturing techniques required for accurate navigation instruments contributed to the development of industrial machinery. The organizational systems needed to manage complex voyages involving hundreds of people and tons of cargo became models for other large-scale enterprises. The financial innovations that emerged from maritime commerce, including insurance, banking, and investment systems, became the foundation for modern capitalism. The risks and rewards of ocean trade required new ways of organizing capital and distributing risk that eventually transformed economic systems on land as well as sea. By the early 19th century, the Great Age of Sail was beginning to give way to steam power, and eventually to the internal combustion engine. The sailing ships that had dominated ocean travel for centuries were gradually replaced by vessels that could move independently of wind and current. This technological revolution would transform maritime travel even more dramatically than the transition from traditional navigation to European sailing techniques. Yet the fundamental patterns established during the Age of Sail continue to influence global development. The trade routes pioneered by sailing ships remained important even when the ships themselves were powered by steam or diesel. The port cities that had grown up around sailing ship commerce continued to serve as centres of global trade. The cultural connections that had been established between distant parts of the world continued to influence political and economic relationships. The environmental impacts of maritime expansion also continued to unfold long after the Age of Sail ended. The biological exchanges that began with European exploration continued to reshape ecosystems around the world. The extraction of resources that had been made possible by global shipping networks intensified with improved transportation technology. The social structures that had emerged from maritime expansion also proved remarkably durable. The international character of maritime commerce continued to influence global culture even as the specific technologies changed. The concentration of wealth in port cities and trading companies continued to shape economic inequality even as new industries emerged. Looking back across the centuries from our contemporary perspective, the Age of Sail appears as a crucial transition period in human history. It was the era when our species completed the process of global expansion that had begun with the first ocean crossings to Australia 50,000 years earlier. It was the moment when all the world's maritime traditions converged to create a single global system of ocean travel. But it was also the beginning of a new phase in human relationship with the natural world, one characterized more by exploitation than by partnership. The intimate knowledge of local environments that had sustained traditional maritime cultures was gradually replaced by more generalized but less nuanced understanding of global systems. The legacy of this transformation continues to influence human society today. Our global economy still depends on the ocean highways that were pioneered during the Age of Sail. Our understanding of ourselves as a single species, sharing a single planet, was shaped by the global perspective that maritime expansion made possible. Our environmental challenges are largely the result of the exploitation patterns that were established during the centuries of maritime colonial expansion. Yet we also inherited the remarkable human capacity for innovation, adaptation, and courage that made maritime expansion possible in the first place. The same ingenuity that enabled traditional navigators to cross empty oceans using only natural cues continues to drive technological development today. The same willingness to venture into the unknown that carried European explorers to new continents continues to motivate scientific research and exploration. The story of sailing, from the first tentative ventures onto calm water to the global networks of the modern world, is ultimately a story about human potential. It demonstrates our species' remarkable ability to overcome seemingly impossible challenges through the combination of technical innovation, cultural transmission, and individual courage. It shows how knowledge accumulated over generations can enable achievements that would be impossible for any individual working alone. But it also demonstrates the profound responsibility that comes with such capabilities. The same technologies that enable remarkable achievements can also cause remarkable damage if not used wisely. The same knowledge that opens new possibilities can also create new dangers if not applied with appropriate caution and respect for natural systems. As we face contemporary challenges that require global cooperation and environmental sensitivity, the lessons learned from thousands of years of maritime history remain relevant. The traditional navigation techniques that enabled sustainable ocean travel for thousands of years offer alternatives to more environmentally destructive modern approaches. The social structures that enabled traditional maritime communities to maintain connections across vast distances while preserving local autonomy, provide models for contemporary global governance. The story of how humans learned to sail is not just historical curiosity, but practical wisdom for addressing contemporary challenges. It reminds us that we are capable of remarkable achievements when we combine technical innovation with cultural wisdom and environmental awareness. It shows us that the barriers we face today, like the water barriers our ancestors faced thousands of years ago, are not permanent obstacles, but temporary challenges waiting for appropriate solutions. The ocean that once represented the absolute limit of human possibility has become our highway to everywhere. The horizon that once marked the end of the known world has become our gateway to unlimited potential. And the courage that first motivated someone to push off from familiar shores and head toward unknown destinations continues to inspire human achievement in every field of endeavor. The first voyage may have been completed long ago, but the journey of human exploration and discovery continues. Every time we face a challenge that seems impossible, every time we venture beyond familiar territory, every time we trust ourselves to the unknown, we are drawing on the same spirit of adventure that has carried our species from the earliest coastal settlements to the farthest reaches of the Pacific and beyond. The waters still call to us, not just the oceans of our planet, but the vast spaces that lie beyond it. The techniques may change, the destinations may be different, but the fundamental human impulse to explore, to discover, to push beyond the boundaries of the possible remains as strong as ever. We are still the species that refuses to accept limits, that sees every horizon as an invitation rather than a barrier. The story of sailing is the story of human possibility itself, a reminder that we are limited not by the challenges we encounter, but only by our willingness to meet them. The first sailors proved that no distance was too great to cross, no destination too remote to reach. Their legacy flows through every subsequent achievement in exploration and discovery, from the deepest ocean trenches to the highest mountain peaks, to the vast reaches of space itself. And that legacy will continue to flow as long as humans retain the courage to look toward distant horizons and see not endings, but beginnings, not barriers, but pathways, not impossibilities, but opportunities waiting to be seized by those bold enough to trust themselves to the unknown. The greatest voyage of all, the journey of human potential itself, has only just begun. The waters that had once carried the first sailors to distant shores were about to witness something unprecedented. By the 15th century, a new kind of maritime expansion was stirring in the harbours of Europe, one that would transform not just how humans crossed oceans, but why they crossed them at all. The age of exploration was about to begin, and with it would come consequences that continue to ripple through our world today. Standing in a Portuguese port in 1420, you might have noticed something different in the air. Not just the familiar scents of salt spray and tar, but something more intangible. An energy, a restlessness, a sense that the world was suddenly larger than anyone had previously imagined. The ships being built in these harbours were different too, larger, more robust, designed not just for coastal trading, but for voyages that might last months or even years. These weren't the elegant outrigger canoes of the Pacific or the reed boats of ancient rivers. These were caravels and galleons, vessels built from European oak and fitted with multiple masts carrying square-rigged and lateen sails that could catch wind from almost any direction. They represented thousands of years of Mediterranean and Atlantic maritime tradition, but they were being pushed toward purposes their designers had never imagined. The motivations driving this new age of exploration were fundamentally different from those that had carried humans across the Pacific centuries earlier. Where Pacific navigators had sought new homes for growing populations, European explorers sought new sources of wealth for growing empires. Where traditional voyagers had moved to empty islands they could settle peacefully, European expeditions targeted populated lands they could exploit economically. The technological foundations were similar in principle, but different in execution. European shipbuilders had solved the fundamental challenges of ocean travel using different methods than their Pacific counterparts. Instead of achieving stability through outriggers, they built deep-keeled vessels with heavy ballast. Instead of reading wave patterns and bird behavior, they relied on magnetic compasses and celestial instruments. Instead of preserving navigation knowledge in songs and oral traditions, they recorded it in written charts and logbooks. The compass itself represented a revolution in navigation technology. This simple device, which may have originated in China and spread westward along trade routes, allowed navigators to maintain consistent direction even when stars were obscured by clouds or when sailing in unfamiliar waters where traditional landmarks were absent. For the first time in human history, direction could be determined independently of environmental cues. Celestial navigation, using instruments like the astrolabe and quadrant, provided another technological breakthrough. These devices allowed navigators to determine their latitude by measuring the height of the sun or specific stars above the horizon. While longitude would remain a challenge until the development of accurate chronometers in the 18th century, the ability to determine north-south position with reasonable accuracy made long-distance ocean navigation far more reliable than ever before. The development of accurate charts represented perhaps the most significant change in navigation technology. For thousands of years, maritime knowledge had been preserved in human memory and transmitted through oral tradition. Now it could be recorded precisely on paper, copied exactly, and shared widely among navigators who had never personally visited the waters they were sailing. Portuguese expeditions along the African coast in the early 15th century established patterns that would characterize European exploration for centuries. These weren't voyages of discovery in the sense of seeking unknown lands, but rather systematic efforts to map and establish trade relationships along coastlines that were known to exist but had never been directly accessible to European commerce. Prince Henry the Navigator, despite never making any significant voyages himself, established a navigation school at Sagres that became a centre for developing and refining oceanic navigation techniques. Here, Portuguese navigators learned to combine traditional Mediterranean sailing methods with innovations borrowed from Arab and African maritime traditions they encountered during their coastal explorations. The economic foundations of European exploration were equally revolutionary. Unlike traditional voyaging, which was typically organised by communities for settlement purposes, European expeditions were increasingly financed by merchants and monarchs seeking profitable returns on their investments. This created pressure for voyages to generate immediate economic benefits rather than simply establishing new communities. The search for alternative routes to Asian spice markets provided the primary motivation for many early European expeditions. Overland trade routes through the Middle East had become expensive and politically unstable, making direct sea routes to Asia extremely attractive to European merchants. The potential profits from eliminating middlemen in the spice trade were enormous, justifying the risks and expenses of unprecedented ocean voyages. Columbus's famous 1492 voyage across the Atlantic was motivated by this same economic logic. By sailing west to reach the East Indies, he hoped to establish a shorter and more profitable route to Asian markets than the traditional eastward journey around Africa. The fact that he encountered an entirely unknown continent instead of reaching Asia was an accident that would have profound consequences for world history. The technological convergence that occurred when European maritime traditions encountered those of other cultures produced remarkable innovations. Portuguese navigators learned astronomical techniques from Arab scholars. Spanish explorers adopted indigenous canoe designs for river navigation in the Americas. Dutch traders incorporated Asian shipbuilding methods into their own vessel designs. And so we reach the end of our journey across time and tide, from bamboo rafts to global empires, from trembling first steps onto water to the mastery of every ocean on Earth. The story of sailing is ultimately the story of us, the species that looked at the world's greatest barriers and decided they were actually doorways. Every horizon conquered, every impossible distance crossed, every fear of the unknown transformed into curiosity about what might be possible. The same courage that carried those first Australians into uncharted waters still flows through our veins today. We remain the children of people who refused to accept limits, who chose the distant shore over the safety of the familiar. The waters remember everything, and they're still calling.